Story 1. I never believed in ghosts, at least not until we moved into that house in the suburbs. It was supposed to be our dream home, a big step up from the small apartment we'd been cramped in for years while my parents saved up. The realtor called it a great deal because it had been a model home, decked out with fancy furniture to entice potential buyers in the neighborhood. Little did we know, the house had a history that no amount of staging could erase. The first thing that struck me about the house was the loft. It was this open area at the top of two stairwells, one in the front of the house and one in the back. You could hear pretty much everything from up there. It was like the heart of the house, pumping sound to every corner. My friends loved it. Jake and Mia, my best friends since middle school, were always over. They'd recently started dating, and let's just say they weren't shy about showing affection. More than once, I'd felt like a third wheel in my own home. One lazy Sunday afternoon, the three of us were up in the loft watching some mindless action movie. Jake and Mia were cuddled up on the couch, more interested in each other than the explosions on screen. I got up to use the bathroom, leaving them tangled up in each other's arms. When I came back a few minutes later, something had changed. Jake and Mia were sitting on opposite ends of the couch looking tense. I figured they'd had a fight. "What's up?" I asked, flopping back down onto the couch. Jake looked at me, his face oddly pale. "Your little sister's home," he said. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Mia chimed in. "We heard her laughing and running up the stairs. Is everything okay? You look freaked out." My heart was pounding. "Guys," I said slowly, "I don't have a little sister." We searched the entire house, but of course, we found nothing. No little girl, no sign that anyone else had been there. When we got back to the loft, Jake and Mia told me what they'd heard in more detail. They described the sound of a young girl laughing, then the distinct noise of small hands slapping against the stairs, as if someone was running up on all fours. That night, after my friends had gone home, I asked my parents if they knew anything about the house's history. That's when they told me the truth. Before it was a model home, a family had lived here. They'd had a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. One day while playing in the loft, she'd climbed onto the railing. She fell. The impact killed her instantly. I didn't sleep well that night, or for many nights after. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind outside my window made me think of that little girl. I found myself avoiding the loft, especially when I was alone in the house. But avoiding the loft didn't stop the strange occurrences. Our house had an intercom system with units in every room that could play music or allow us to communicate throughout the house. The main control unit was on the ground floor, right next to where the little girl had fallen. And sometimes, always at night, always at the same time, we'd be woken up by the sound of static coming through the intercom. The first time it happened, I thought maybe I'd left it on by accident. I trudged down from my third-floor bedroom to the main unit to switch it off. But when I got there, I saw that the talk button was depressed, as if an invisible finger was holding it down. The moment I touched the button, the static stopped. This happened again and again, always following the same pattern. Static at night, the talk button mysteriously held down. Silence the moment I touched it. Each time as I walked down those stairs in the dark, I half expected to see a small figure at the bottom, waiting for me. But I never did. Jake and Mia remained convinced of what they'd heard that day in the loft. They'd come over and get quiet whenever we passed the spot where the girl had fallen, as if paying their respects. I never experienced anything as direct as what they described, but the nightly intercom incidents were enough to keep me on edge. As the years went by, the occurrences became less frequent. The intercom would stay silent for weeks, then months at a time. By the time I left for college, they'd stopped altogether. Story 2. I was just a baby when it happened, so I only know this part from what my father told me years later, his voice still shaking as he recounted that night. He woke up in the dead of night, the kind of stillness where even the house seems to be holding its breath. And there, hovering above the bed, was what looked like a ghost of my mother. But it wasn't really her. It couldn't be, because my mother was right there, sleeping peacefully beside him. This apparition was screaming silently, its face contorted in anguish as it tried desperately to force its way into my mother's sleeping body. My father, a pragmatic man who had never believed in the supernatural, was shaken to his core. He refused to spend another night in that house. We moved out the very next day, leaving behind not just the manor, but also a part of our family's history and my father's skepticism. For years, that was the end of the story. We settled into a new apartment, a modern place with no history, no shadows lurking in corners. I grew up hearing the tale of that night as a kind of family legend, something to be whispered about but never truly believed. After all, I had no memory of it, and ghosts weren't real, right? Then came the winter morning that changed everything. I was about 6 years old enough to form lasting memories, old enough to know the difference between dreams and reality, or so I thought. It was early, that blue hour just after dawn, when the world seems suspended between night and day. My mother and I had just woken up. She went to the kitchen to make us both a warm cup of milk, a comforting ritual on cold mornings. I stayed in the bedroom, cozy under the blankets, watching the strip of light from the hallway illuminate the dust motes floating in the air. That's when it happened. The dust. It started to move. Not in the random, drifting patterns of normal dust, but with purpose. It was coalescing, coming together to form a shape, a human shape, a woman's shape. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of fascination and growing terror, the dust took on more and more detail. Suddenly, standing there in our modern apartment was a perfect replica of my mother, but not as I knew her. This version of her was dressed in clothes from another century, her hair styled in a way I'd only seen in old photographs. The apparition stood there for a moment, solid yet somehow insubstantial at the same time. Then, without so much as glancing in my direction, it turned and walked out of the room, following the path my real mother had taken just moments before. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was I dreaming? Had I imagined it? But no, I could still see the disturbance in the dust where the figure had formed and then dissipated. When my mother returned with our milk, I was too scared to tell her what I'd seen. How could I explain that I just watched a ghost version of her from the 1800s materialize in our bedroom? Would she even believe me? It wasn't until years later, when I finally worked up the courage to tell her about that morning, that she went pale and shared with me the story of what had happened in the manor house. The pieces started to fall into place, forming a picture that was as fascinating as it was terrifying. What was this entity that looked like my mother? Why did it appear in 2 different times, in 2 different places? Was it trying to possess her, to take her place? And if so, why? These questions haunted me for years. I researched doppelgangers, spirits, every paranormal phenomenon I could find that might explain what my father and I had seen, but nothing quite fit. Nothing explained why this thing, whatever it was so fixated on my mother. It wasn't until I came across an old forum post about similar experiences that a truly chilling thought occurred to me. The post ended with a warning that stayed with me ever since. If your mother was outside, then I think you should worry what took her place inside. That's when the real fear set in. All these years I'd been worried about what I'd seen. But what if the real danger was what I hadn't seen? What if, on that winter morning, the thing that walked back into the room with a cup of warm milk wasn't my mother at all? I've never been able to shake that thought. Every time I look at old family photos, every time I remember that morning, I find myself studying my mother's face, searching for some sign, some tiny indication that the woman in my memories is not the same one who raised me. Is she my mother? Or is she the thing that took her place? Story 3. I had just landed a new job in New York City. The excitement of starting a new chapter in my life was palpable, but it also meant I had to move across the country. My brother Jake had volunteered to help me with the final leg of the journey. We had borrowed a beat-up van from our uncle, loaded it to the brim with the last of my belongings, and were ready to hit the road. Just before we left, I checked my watch and called my girlfriend Sarah to let her know we were about to depart. We'll be there in about 8 hours, I told her, factoring in the sluggish pace we'd have to maintain due to our heavy load. Jake, ever the perfectionist, double-checked the time on the kitchen clock. Little did we know how crucial this detail would become. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. We chatted about my new job, reminisced about childhood memories, and speculated about what life in the Big Apple would be like. The van chugged along at a steady 80 kilometers per hour, its engine protesting under the weight of my life's possessions. As we approached the outskirts of New York City, something odd happened. Jake turned to me and said, "Hey, Alex, is it just me? Or can you not remember most of the trip?" I laughed it off at first, but as I tried to recall the journey, I realized he was right. My last clear memory was of passing a dingy gas station about an hour into our drive. Everything after that was a blur. We chalked it up to fatigue and the monotony of highway driving, but a nagging feeling persisted in the back of my mind. When we finally pulled up to my new apartment, Sarah was waiting for us on the front steps. Her expression was a mix of relief and confusion. "Did you guys break every speed limit in existence?" she asked half-jokingly. "You're almost an hour early." Jake and I exchanged bewildered looks. How could we possibly be early? We had been driving well below the speed limit the entire time. As we unloaded the van, we tried to piece together what had happened. We both distinctly remembered checking the time before leaving, and I had that phone call with Sarah to corroborate our departure time. It just didn't add up. That night, after Jake had left and Sarah had gone home, I lay awake in my new apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes and the unfamiliar sounds of the city. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had occurred during our journey. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of my bizarre encounters with time. A few days later, I started my new job at a marketing firm in Manhattan. The work was challenging but exciting, and I was eager to make a good impression. On Friday of that first week, we wrapped up early, and a few of my new colleagues suggested we take a trip down to Ground Zero. None of us had been there before, and we had about 3 hours to spare before a company dinner with our parent organization. There were 4 of us: myself, Tom, a seasoned account manager in his mid-40s, Lisa, our creative director, who was nearing retirement, and Zach, an intern about my age. We all checked our phones and watches before boarding the subway, making sure we had plenty of time for our excursion. The ride to Lower Manhattan was filled with excited chatter about our first week and speculation about what we might see at the site. As we emerged from the subway station and approached Ground Zero, a palpable shift in energy washed over us. The bustling city seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. We walked around in silence, taking in the makeshift memorials and informational signs that dotted the area. The absence of the Twin Towers left a void not just in the skyline, but in the very fabric of the city. I found myself lost in thought, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened here. It felt like we had only been there for a short while when Tom's voice cut through my reverie. "Guys, we need to go. Now." His tone was urgent, bordering on panic. "We've been here for almost 2 hours." I blinked in confusion, certain he must be mistaken. We had just arrived, hadn't we? But as I checked my phone, my heart sank. Tom was right. We had somehow lost track of nearly 2 hours. We all stared at our devices in disbelief, each confirming the impossible passage of time. Panic set in as we realized we'd never make it back to the hotel in time to prepare for the dinner. We raced back to the subway station, our minds reeling as we tried to process what had happened. How could we have lost so much time without realizing it? As we sat on the train, a heavy silence fell over our group. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, grappling with the inexplicable experience we had just shared. About halfway through the ride, I glanced at my phone again, more out of habit than necessity. What I saw made my blood run cold. The time on my phone had changed. It now showed that we had over 2 hours until dinner, exactly as it had before we left for Ground Zero. I blinked hard, certain I must be seeing things. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "check your phones again." One by one, they pulled out their devices. The looks of confusion quickly turned to shock as they realized what I had discovered. All of our phones and watches had somehow reset, erasing the lost time we had experienced at Ground Zero. Lisa, her voice trembling slightly, broke the silence. "This isn't possible. We all saw the time when we were down there. We all felt how long we were there. What's happening?" Tom, ever the rational one, tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination? or a strange electromagnetic field that affected our devices? But deep down, we all knew that no conventional explanation could account for what we had experienced. The eerie atmosphere at Ground Zero, the collective loss of time, and the inexplicable reset of our devices, it all pointed to something beyond our understanding. As we exited the subway and made our way back to the hotel, I couldn't help but think about my cross-country trip with Jake just days earlier. 2 instances of lost time in less than a week. What were the odds? I felt a chill run down my spine as I considered the possibility that these events might be connected. That night at dinner, our group was uncharacteristically quiet. The others at the table noticed our subdued demeanor, and eventually Zach cracked under the pressure and shared our story. To our surprise, one of the executives from our parent company leaned in with interest. "You're not the first to experience something like that down there," he said in a low voice. "I've heard similar stories from other people who visited the site. Strange time discrepancies, unexplained phenomena. Some say it's the residual energy from the tragedy. Others think it's something different." His words hung in the air, leaving us with more questions than answers. As the dinner progressed, I found myself unable to focus on the conversations around me. My mind kept drifting back to that lost hour on the road with Jake and the surreal experience at Ground Zero. I reached out to Jake, curious if he had experienced anything unusual since our trip. He hadn't, but our conversation brought back the vivid memory of that lost hour on the road. We talked for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. "Do you think it's connected to what happened at Ground Zero?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it feels like more than just coincidence." Story 4. I was 10 years old when it happened. Our family had just moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and rolling fields. It was the kind of place where you could hear every creak and groan of the aging structure, where shadows seemed to dance in the corners of your vision. That summer night, I went to bed feeling uneasy. There was a storm brewing outside, and the wind howled through the trees, creating eerie whispers that seemed to call my name. As I drifted off to sleep, I had no idea that I was about to experience something that would change my life forever. In my dream, I found myself alone in the house during the day. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I wandered from room to room, a sense of unease growing with each step. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Then I heard it, a slow, rhythmic crunching sound coming from the driveway. It was like tires on gravel, but much slower, more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way to the front porch, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw made my blood run cold. An old-fashioned covered wagon was making its way down our driveway. It was the kind you'd see in old Western movies, with wooden wheels and a canvas top. But there was something wrong with it. The wood looked rotted, the canvas stained and torn, and it was moving on its own. No horses in sight. A wave of dread washed over me, and I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I frantically locked every door and window in the house. As I turned the last lock, I heard the wagon come to a stop outside. Driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I made my way down to the basement. There was a small window in the door that looked out onto the driveway, and I knew I could see the wagon from there without being seen. As I peered through the glass, a figure climbed down from the wagon seat. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit that seemed to absorb the daylight around it. But it was his face that made my heart stop, or rather the lack of one. Where his features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, broken only by the brim of a black top hat. The faceless man turned toward the basement window, and even though he had no eyes, I knew he was looking right at me. A silent scream built in my throat as he moved to the back of the wagon and pulled off the cover. What I saw next would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Hanging from the supports at the top of the wagon were people, men, women, children, their feet dangling lifelessly, ropes around their necks. At first I thought they were dead, their faces slack and pale. But then the faceless man raised his hands and their heads began to change. It started slowly at first, a slight swelling that quickly grew more pronounced. Their cheeks puffed out, their eyes bulged, and their skin took on a sickly red hue. It was as if their heads were balloons being inflated, growing to grotesque, cartoonish proportions. All the while, the faceless man kept his attention fixed on me. Even without eyes, I could feel the weight of his gaze, the silent promise that I would be next. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the horrific scene before me. Just as I thought I couldn't take anymore, just as I was sure my own head would explode from the terror, I woke up. The relief of realizing it was just a dream was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of my room, I realized that the power was out. The digital clock by my bed was dark, and the usual hum of the house was replaced by an eerie silence. Panic set in as the images from my nightmare came flooding back. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my bedside drawer, but it refused to turn on. Dead batteries, of course, because why wouldn't they be on the one night I needed them most? I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake the whole house. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every gust of wind outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was convinced that if I looked out my window, I'd see that wagon sitting in our driveway, the faceless man waiting for me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and made a mad dash for my parents' room, navigating the dark hallway by memory and sheer desperation. I burst into their room, a sobbing mess, and spent the rest of the night huddled on their floor. My parents, bless them, didn't ask too many questions. They assumed it was just the storm and the power outage that had scared me. I didn't have the words to explain what I had seen, what I had felt. How could I describe the faceless man, the hanging bodies, the grotesque inflation? It all seemed too bizarre, too terrifying to put into words. So I kept it to myself. As the years passed, the nightmare faded to the back of my mind, filed away with other childhood fears and fantasies, but it never truly left me. On dark nights, when the wind howled just right, I'd find myself checking the driveway, half expecting to see that wagon rolling towards the house. It wasn't until more than a decade later that the true strangeness of that night would reveal itself. I was home for the holidays, sitting around the fireplace with my family. We'd had a few drinks, and the conversation had turned to dreams and nightmares. Everyone was sharing their weirdest sleep experiences, laughing at the absurdity of some, shuddering at others. When it came to my turn, I hesitated. I had never told anyone about that nightmare. It had always felt too personal, too bizarre, but maybe enough time had passed. Maybe I could finally talk about it without the old fear gripping me. So I started to tell the story, keeping it brief, leaving out the more gruesome details. I described the wagon coming down the driveway, the sense of dread that came with it. But before I could get any further, my younger sister Emma interrupted me. "Was the man wearing a top hat?" she asked, her face pale. The room fell silent. I stared at her, a chill running down my spine. "How did you know that?" I whispered. Emma's eyes were wide, her hands shaking slightly as she set down her drink. "Because I had the same dream," she said. "When I was about 8 or 9, I remember the wagon and the man in the black suit and top hat. He did something to the people in the back of the wagon, didn't he?" We spent the next hour comparing notes, filling in details for each other. The similarities were uncanny. The isolated house, the faceless man, the grotesque fate of his victims. We even remembered the same feeling of being watched, of knowing we were next. Our parents listened in stunned silence, looking back and forth between us as if trying to catch us in some elaborate prank. But the fear in our eyes, the way our voices shook as we recounted the details, it was all too real. "How is this possible?" I asked, more to myself than anyone else. "How could we have had the same nightmare?" No one had an answer. We tossed around theories. Maybe one of us had told the other about the dream and forgotten. Maybe we had both seen the same scary movie, and it had wormed its way into our subconscious. But none of the explanations felt right. I distinctly remembered keeping the dream to myself, too frightened and embarrassed to share it with anyone. And Emma swore she had done the same, convinced that no one would believe her if she told them. As the night wore on and we exhausted every rational explanation, a new, unsettling thought began to take root in my mind. What if it wasn't just a dream? What if somehow Emma and I had experienced something real that night? Something that our young minds could only process as a nightmare. But then we found one story online. It was from an old man in rural Maine who claimed that when he was a boy, back in the 1930s, there had been stories of a traveling salesman who would come to town in an old wagon. Children would go missing whenever he passed through, only to be found days later, miles from home, with no memory of where they had been. The description he gave of the salesman, tall, thin, dressed all in black with a top hat, sent chills down our spines. It was too similar to be a coincidence, yet too impossible to be true. We never found a definitive answer to what happened that night,